In the midst of the most devastating conflict of the 20th century, Germany developed a structure of unprecedented research and innovation. Beyond the military, the National Socialist regime also gave rise, directly or indirectly, to innovations that are still surprising today for their scope and permanence. The popular Fanta soft drink was created in Nazi Germany as an alternative to Coca-Cola following the trade embargo. Night vision, a key technology in modern operations, had its first practical applications in the tanks and weapons of the Third Reich. The concept of the intramodular module, fundamental to modern industrial manufacturing, was explored to optimize war production. Even cultural and sporting elements were born or institutionalized at that time. The Olympic torch, which became a global symbol, was introduced into the 1936 Berlin Games under a stage design designed by the Nazi propaganda apparatus. Furthermore, the rivalry between the Dassler brothers, regime collaborators, gave rise to the Adidas and Puma brands, icons of contemporary sport. These examples demonstrate that, amidst authoritarianism, developments flourished whose influence persists long after the end of the Third Reich. Volkswagen Beetle, the car born on Hitler's orders. In 1934, the German government was looking for an affordable car that any family could afford. Hitler commissioned the design to Ferdinand Porsche, who had been working on vehicles for some time. The plan was to have a simple, economical and reliable car. That same year, they signed an agreement with the German Automobile Association to begin the project. The car was named KDF Wagen, after the regime's Strength Through Joy program. It was to cost less than 1,000 marks to make it affordable for everyone. Over the next few years, Porsche and his team refined the design. In May 1938, they organized a large event in Fallersleben. Hitler laid the foundation stone for the plant that would manufacture the car. That location later became an entire city, later named Wolfsburg. At that event, it was announced that the factory would not only make cars, but would also be used to promote the idea of a modern Germany. The car was not only a means of transportation, it was also part of the image the regime wanted to project at home and abroad. When war broke out, the civilian model was discontinued. Instead, they adapted the design to create vehicles for military use. One of these was the Kübelwagen, a rear-wheel drive Jeep-like vehicle which was used on several fronts. They also released the Schwimmwagen, which was amphibious and could cross rivers and lakes. Throughout the war, not a single unit was sold to the public. All production went to the army. Although thousands of people had paid in advance for the civilian car, they never received it. The priority was the front lines. At the end of the war, the factory remained in British hands. Instead of closing it, they decided to continue with the model that had already been designed. From then on, production began on the car that would later be known as the Volkswagen Beetle. The car that had been born as a project of the regime ended up being one of the best-selling in the world. Its design, S by MIT, was around for decades and was manufactured in several countries. Its rear engine, rounded shape and distinctive sound made it recognizable across the globe. What began as a commission from the Third Reich eventually became a symbol of civilian transport. Although its origins are directly linked to the dictatorship, the Beetle enjoyed a second life after the war, no longer for propaganda or political purposes. The Olympic torch, a Nazi invention that lives on today. In July 1936, the fire was lit in Olympia with a mirror made by Zeiss. A woman dressed in a white robe lit the torch using concentrated sunlight. From there, it began the journey of more than 3,000 kilometers to Berlin. The idea for the relay came from Karl Diem, the organizer of the Games. He was inspired by ancient Greek rituals, although they never actually existed. He planned for more than 3,300 people to run 1 kilometer each to carry the flame. From the beginning, the Nazi government used it as part of its image campaign. Goebbels arranged for everything to be recorded and broadcast on the radio. Leni Riefenstahl also filmed parts of the route for her documentary. The torches were manufactured by the Krupp company. They were made of steel and carried a type of fuel that could withstand wind and rain. The mirror used to light the first torch was made by Zeiss Optics. The route passed through Greece, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. In Austria, the torch was greeted with Nazi salutes and flags. The entire journey took place from July 20th to August 1st, when Fritz Schilgen entered the stadium and lit the cauldron. Hitler was part of the opening ceremony that day. Schilgen was chosen not for his athletic achievements, but because his running style fit the image of the type of person the regime wanted to portray. The goal of the event wasn't sporting. What they sought was to connect the image of Nazi Germany with classical Greece, to appear heirs to that culture. They wanted to show organization, power, and unity to the rest of the world. Many people thought it was a peaceful and novel gesture, but in reality, it was a setup designed to spread the regime's message, using symbols, cameras, and the media, all well planned to reinforce Nazi propaganda. After 1936, the torch relay was repeated at every Olympic Games. Although it began as a staged event created by the regime over the years, it became part of the official Olympic ritual. Regime sneakers, the true story behind Adidas and Puma. In the 1930s, two brothers named Adolf and Rudolf Dassler owned a sports shoe factory in Herzogenaurach, a German city. There, they produced sneakers in a family business they shared. During the 1936 Berlin Olympics, Adolf Dassler arranged for American athlete Jesse Owens to compete wearing his sneakers. Owens won several medals, bringing the factory worldwide attention. The company operated under the Nazi regime. Like many other German companies of the time, they also manufactured products for the military. The business remained active throughout the war. Both brothers were members of the Nazi Party. Their factory continued operating during the conflict, producing boots and other items for the armed forces. Collaboration with the army was part of their daily work. But in the midst of the war, arguments broke out between the two. Adolf and Rudolf's relationship broke down. After the conflict ended, they each went their separate ways and decided to start their own business. Adolf founded Adidas. He used the first letters of his first and last name to name the new company. He stayed in the same city and set up his own factory. Rudolf went across the river and started a different company. Initially, he called it Ruder, but later changed the name to Puma. He also focused on athletic footwear. Both brands were born in the same town and came from the same family. But from that moment on, they became direct rivals. The feud between the brothers caused even neighbors to split. Over time, Adidas and Puma became two of the world's largest sports brands. But their origins date back to the years of World War II, when they were still working together in a single factory. The sneakers worn by Jesse Owens in 1936 were made by them, before either brand existed. That Dassler factory was the beginning of everything that would come later. During the early years, both Adidas and Puma grew rapidly. They used their contacts, their experience, and the models they already knew to create new products. The foundation was the same they had used during the regime. Although they later distanced themselves from their past, the two brands started in the same place, in the middle of the war, under a government that included them in its industrial system. Today, they see themselves as lifelong rivals, but the story began with two brothers who shared a factory, ideas, and sneakers. And it all began in Nazi Germany. Kunchers nail, the medical tool that changed the war. In 1939, German physician Gerhard Kuncher devised a different way to repair fractures in the body's long bones. He used a steel tube placed inside the bone's canal to hold it firm while it healed. This metal rod was then inserted directly into the center of the damaged bone. Before that, when someone broke their femur or tibia, the most common approach was to leave them lying down for weeks, with the bones stretched by a system of pulleys and weights. This method didn't always work, and it took a long time for the patient to walk again. With the nail Kuncher proposed, the broken bone was fixed from the inside. This prevented it from moving and helped the body reattach it without having to keep the patient immobile for so long. It was completely different from what had been done until then. The design was simple, a metal rod with slits at the ends, which was inserted through a small surgical cut. Using special tools, doctors fitted it inside the broken bone and left it there to act as support. Kuncher presented his invention in military hospitals, but at first it was not accepted by all. Many doctors still believed that bones could only heal if left untouched. However, within a short time, his technique began to prove that it worked better than what had been previously used. During World War II, the German army began using this method with wounded soldiers. Those who fractured their legs could get back on their feet within a few weeks. something that had previously seemed impossible at the time. This led to the nail's increasing use. Meanwhile, in other countries, the invention went unnoticed for a while. But when the war ended and Allied doctors saw the results, they began to copy the technique. Soon, the intramedullary nail became common outside of Germany as well. Kunchers' model served as the basis for many other similar devices that followed. From then on, surgery for broken bones took a complete turn. It was no longer necessary to keep patients bedridden for months or use casts that immobilized half the body. Furthermore, the method helped reduce complications. Because the injured were mobile more quickly, the risk of infection, blood clots, and loss of muscle mass decreased. All of this gave the invention an important place in medical history. Although it was created in the midst of war, the Kuncher spike was not a weapon, a vehicle, or a radar. But it allowed thousands of wounded German soldiers to return to the front or recover without becoming disabled. It was a tool used to keep the troops on their feet. The idea of inserting a metal rod into a bone seemed risky, but in practice it worked better than anything that had come before. This led to its widespread use not only in Germany, but also in civilian hospitals in other countries after the conflict. Today, the technique has changed, but the basic idea remains the same. The nail Kuncher invented was the first step toward what is now known as internal fixation. His invention remains part of modern fracture treatment. What began as a solution to speed up soldiers' recovery ended up being a real improvement in general medicine. And although few people know it, this breakthrough emerged from an operating room in the heart of Nazi Germany. The V1 and the Reichenberg, from the flying bomb to the piloted suicide missile. It can be said that the origin of the V1 was when a useful engine appeared. Because if a useful engine hadn't been available, it's likely no one would have come up with the idea of a flying bomb, or if they had, they wouldn't have taken it seriously. What decided everything was having a simple, cheap engine that could push hard enough. That development began in 1927 and 1928 when an aerodynamics expert named Paul Schmidt conceived of a pulse engine. The idea wasn't so complicated if one had already had that inspiration. It was a tube with a grill with slats that opened and closed at the inlet, along with a system that injected gasoline and a spark plug to ignite it. This type of engine had a couple of drawbacks. For starters, it couldn't sustain itself at speeds below 300 kilometers per hour, so it couldn't be started from a standstill like a normal airplane. It also couldn't accelerate or slow down. It ran at a fixed speed, climbing from 300 to its maximum speed on its own. Once it reached its ideal speed, it continued at that speed without changing speeds. It also wasn't useful above 2,000 meters because there the air would become scarce and the engine would fail. And after 30 to 45 minutes of driving, the valves would be burned and damaged and the aircraft would lose its engine. So although it was a fairly ingenious form of propulsion, it didn't seem to be very useful in ordinary aviation. However, in 1934, the same Professor Schmidt proposed that this engine could be used to power an aerial torpedo. But that suggestion doesn't seem to have been taken seriously. In 1938, the German Air Ministry began to look more seriously at the issue of jet engines, and to make sure it didn't miss any opportunities, it commissioned the Argus company to manufacture one of the engines Schmidt had designed. Argus produced it, achieving a thrust of about 300 kilograms, and delivered it to the ministry. They played with it a bit, analyzed it, and seeing that the army was already tinkering with missiles at Peenemünde, they decided the Air Force should also get involved, but with more force. So they called in the Fieseler company to propose a design. And at the end of 1941, Chief Engineer Lusser submitted some sketches. They considered it, and on June 19, 1942, they authorized the development of the flying bomb. To throw people off the scent, they officially named it Flakzielgerät 76, a name that sounded like a practice target for anti-aircraft guns. Fieseler named it the Phi 103, as he did with all his models, but few used that name. In southern England, the bomb began to be called the Doodlebug. At the same time, the Argus company was commissioned to produce the engine, and the Walter firm, an expert in rockets and fuels, was tasked with finding a way to launch the device at over 300 kilometers per hour from the ground so that it could remain airborne. The project progressed quite quickly. The first successful launch of the FZG-76 was on December 24, 1942, in Peenemünde. Many failed tests followed until the problems were resolved one by one. The final design of the FZG-76 was a straight-wing aircraft with the pulse engine mounted high aft of the body and rudder. Inside the fuselage, from front to back, it had a propeller that measured the distance traveled, a warhead with 850 kilos of explosives and 3 types of detonators, a tank with 570 liters of cheap 75-octane gasoline, 2 compressed air cylinders that powered the tail and altitude control system, a 30-volt battery with 42 cells, a main gyroscope, and the servos and automatic controls. The procedure was as follows. The tank was filled, a charged battery was connected, compressed air was poured into the cylinders, and then the aircraft was taken to a metal-free area to calibrate the compass and set the course toward the target. It was then placed on a launch ramp. The ramp was a long, slotted tube about 45 meters long, divided into sections that were joined with bolts and mounted on a concrete and steel base at the appropriate angle. The tube was open at both ends, and the rear end had a bayonet-like lock. A large dumbbell-shaped piston was inserted into the tube with a fin extending through the slot. A flexible sealing tube was placed in the slot to prevent leaks. Above the tube was a cart that supported the missile and rested against the piston fin. Then, a cart containing a combustion chamber and tanks containing hydrogen peroxide and potassium permanganate, along with 3 compressed air cylinders, was attached. This cart was connected to the rear of the tube with a locking system. Near the ramp, the distribution unit was installed on a metal support. There were more air cylinders, pressure gauges, and valves for managing the compressed air that powered the engine during startup and activated the fuel valve. There was also a transformer with a coil that sent current to the spark plug through a flexible cable. Once the missile was on the cart and tightly fitted to the piston, the operators would go to a nearby shelter and from there initiate the firing sequence. Air was blown into the engine to simulate flight, and the spark was activated so the spark plug would ignite the engine. After about 7 seconds of warm-up, the valves on the rear cart would open. This mixed the reactants and generated a jet of superhot steam inside the combustion chamber. The piston, held in place by a pin that broke under pressure, would begin to move through the tube, pushing the cart and the missile forward. The steam pressure would force the sealing tube to close the gap. The missile would be launched at over 400 kilometers per hour. Upon reaching the end of the ramp, the piston would fly out, the cart would release, and the missile would continue on its own, climbing at the same incline as the ramp and gaining speed. Each site had several pistons and 2 combustion carts. While one was in use, the other was being prepared. At the end of each launch, the chemical-stained base was cleaned with special suits and rubber boots. After the mass deployment of the flying bomb, an even more risky version was tested. The same structure of the Phi-103 was adapted to include a cockpit, basic controls, and a seat with a harness. This model was named Reichenberg and was designed to be guided by a pilot to the target. The main change was to replace the automatic system with a manual control post. The jet engine was still the Argus AS-014, mounted on the fuselage, but the internal space was reorganized to allow a person to enter. It had no landing gear or real escape capability. Testing began in 1944. Training versions without an explosive charge were prepared. To launch them, Heinkel He-111 bombers were used, which dropped the aircraft from the air. Some pilots managed to stabilize their flight after the drop and remain in a straight line, but the results were unstable. The cockpit was very cramped. There was no room for detailed controls or safety mechanisms. Although an ejection seat could theoretically be installed, a functional one was never implemented. Flying the aircraft meant assuming the impact would be final. The volunteers came from a unit called Leonidas, part of the Luftwaffe. They received training in simple gliders before moving on to the Phi-103R. They weren't told it was a suicide attack, but they knew they had no real way back. In practice, attempts were made to plan a landing, but the design didn't allow for it. The idea behind the project was to hit targets more precisely. Having a pilot eliminated the deviations that the original V-1 had. The bomb went directly to the target, guided visually. This, however, depended on the plane reaching the area with good visibility and without being intercepted. More than 170 Reichenberg aircraft were built. They were stored ready for use but were never deployed in combat. The Luftwaffe Supreme Command, although allowing testing, never approved its use in real operations. Allied advances meant they weren't ready in time. Unlike other weapons, this manned version of the Phi-103 remained a prototype. Its existence demonstrated the level of desperation of the High Command, seeking extreme precision at the cost of the pilot's life. The program was shut down without a single attack being launched with this variant. The V2 project from Peenemünde to London. In October 1942, the British managed to see an aerial photo showing a large artificial sandbank on the island of Euston, just off the Baltic coast. On top of this base, they had set up what appeared to be a concrete platform, and next to it, a complex of buildings. This image was one of the first concrete clues that Germany was preparing something out of the ordinary. What they didn't yet know was that right there, in Peenemünde, the development of what would become the world's first ballistic missile was underway. The rocket being built there was the A4, later known as the V2, the next step after the V1. The project had begun much earlier, in the 1930s, with a team headed by Werner von Braun, a young engineer with ideas far ahead of his time, working for the German army. The goal was to develop a missile that could fly outside the atmosphere, move on its own, and hit targets hundreds of kilometers away. From the outset, the plan was ambitious. They wanted the rocket to rise under its own power, follow a programmed path without external guidance, and carry a heavy explosive payload. To achieve this, von Braun and his team focused on solving three key issues: a sufficiently powerful engine, a reliable control system, and a structure that could withstand the pressure of the journey. The fuel they used was a liquid mixture of alcohol and liquid oxygen. Powerful pumps were needed to move these two elements toward the explosion chamber. This system was powered by turbines driven by steam generated by a reaction between hydrogen peroxide and sodium permanganate. Once ignited, the engine released burning gases that shot out at high speed through a nozzle propelling the rocket upward. To prevent it from veering off course, the rocket had a system of gyroscopes that indicated its direction and small fins that rotated to keep it stable. They also used a system of rudders inside the engine jet to keep the aircraft on course during takeoff. Higher up, during flight, movable surfaces at the rear of the rocket helped correct small deviations. The rocket's structure was made of metal with an aerodynamic shape that allowed it to penetrate the air with less resistance. It had a warhead weighing almost a ton of explosives mounted on top. The rest of the body housed the engine, fuel tanks, control system, and guidance mechanisms. The launch wasn't simple. Each V2 required a mobile installation composed of several vehicles, one carrying the rocket, another bringing the fuel, another holding the oxidizers, and another holding the ignition system. All of these had to coordinate to mount the rocket in a vertical position, fill it with fuel, and activate the entire system. Once ready, ignition was carried out from a command post using long cables, located away from the launch site for safety reasons. The first successful launch of a complete V2 was on October 3, 1942. It took off from Peenemünde, climbed to an altitude of more than 80 kilometers, and landed 190 kilometers from the launch point. With that, the Germans proved that their project worked and that the idea of an intercontinental ballistic missile was no longer science fiction. From that moment on, it began mass production with the idea of using it as a weapon of retaliation against Allied cities. Once the V2 was in action, there was no stopping it. Upon ignition, it climbed in a straight line to an altitude of about 80 or 90 kilometers, then followed a sharp curve and descended at high speed. In the final stretch, the missile fell at over 5,000 kilometers per hour. When it impacted, nothing could be heard before the explosion because it was traveling faster than the speed of sound. This made it impossible to detect in time, let alone stop with the anti-aircraft defenses that existed at the time. Unlike the V1, which had a relatively slow flight and a noisy engine, the V2 couldn't be heard or seen before impact. It wasn't known that one had fallen until it had exploded. The British tried using radar to track its trajectory, but with such a short reaction time it was useless, and because it flew so high and so fast it couldn't be intercepted by aircraft either. London was the hardest hit by these attacks, although rockets were also launched against other cities, such as Antwerp. In total, the V2s caused thousands of deaths and injuries, as well as considerable material damage. Although their accuracy was limited, and their impact on the war itself was not decisive, the psychological effect was profound. People had no warning. They only heard the explosion and saw the disaster. As for manufacturing, the V2 wasn't built in ordinary factories. It was done in underground tunnels, like those at Mittelwerk near Nordhausen. There, the rockets were produced with the help of forced laborers, many of them concentration camp prisoners. The conditions were extremely harsh. Thousands died from exhaustion, mistreatment, or accidents during the assembly of the missiles. Production was organized by General Hans Kammler, who was in charge of directing the entire assembly and transportation system. The rocket was shipped by train in parts and then assembled near the launch site. This mobility gave Germany a certain tactical advantage, as it made it difficult for the Allies to detect and destroy the launch points before they were used. Once ready to fire, the process was delicate. The tanks were filled shortly before takeoff because the liquids were unstable. All electrical, pressure and control systems were checked. When everything was verified, the ignition was activated from a protected console. Within seconds, the rocket took off, disappearing into the sky in a white trail. Despite its complexity and the effort involved in manufacturing and launching it, the V-2 was the first true rocket used in combat. It was also the direct origin of all modern missiles. After the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union brought engineers, plans and parts to launch their own space and military programs. The development of intercontinental rockets, satellite launches, and even missions to the moon began here with V-2 technology. Radar, secret signals, and the electronic warfare of the Third Reich. Germany began the war with a clear advantage in remote detection systems. One of the first radars to operate was the Freya, installed at fixed stations on the coast. It could detect enemy aircraft at over 100 kilometers and provide timely warning to defense centers. Although it lacked accuracy in calculating altitude, it was useful for launching fighters into the air. Later, the more accurate Würzburg radar was developed. This radar had a parabolic antenna and was primarily used to direct anti-aircraft artillery fire. It was connected to optical and mechanical systems that helped track moving targets. Hundreds of these devices were placed in strategic locations along with searchlights and cannons. In parallel, work was carried out on radars for night fighter aircraft. The most widely used was the Liechtenstein radar, mounted on the front of fighters. It allowed pilots to find enemy bombers in the dark by using reflected echoes. This advance completely changed nighttime air operations, which had previously been almost blind. There was also a maritime radar called SeaTact installed on warships. It worked similarly to the Freya, but adapted for use at sea. It made it possible to locate enemy ships and aircraft more quickly than through direct observation. It was used on cruisers and battleships during the early stages of the conflict. In addition to radar, the Germans worked with radio navigation devices. One of the best known was the Knickerbein system, which transmitted signals from the ground in the form of crossed beams. When a bomber flew over the crossing signals, the pilot knew to release the bombs. This was a technique for attacking with greater precision without needing to see the target. This system was followed by more complex ones, such as the X-Gerät and Y-Gerät, which combined radio and timing to calculate the exact moment of release. They were useful when weather made it difficult to view targets from the air. Although the British did jam them, the aircraft worked well for a time. When the Allies began using countermeasures, the Germans responded with improvements. The SN2 radar was introduced, a more powerful version of the Liechtenstein radar with greater range and less interference. Frequencies were also adjusted to avoid jamming. These new versions were used primarily in night fighters. The British had begun using metal strips, known as windows, dropped from aircraft to generate false radar signals. In response, German technicians developed filters and techniques to distinguish real echoes from fake ones. Even so, the saturation of space with false signals made air defense difficult. On the ground, receivers were also designed to locate enemy transmissions. One system, called Corfu, detected Allied radar signals, such as those of H-2S, used by British bombers. Once an aircraft was located by its active radar, it could be tracked with anti-aircraft artillery or fighter jets sent in search. Submarines also received warning systems. Devices were installed that warned if enemy radar was searching for them. This allowed U-boats to submerge before being detected by Allied aircraft. These sensors did not block the signal, but they did allow for a timely escape. Regarding communications, the German army used short and long-range radios with varying levels of encryption. Important signals were sent via the Enigma system, which used internal rotors to change the letters of the message. It was configured differently each day. Although initially seemingly indecipherable, the Allies later managed to break the code. For tactical use, vehicles carried smaller radios. Tanks had internal intercoms and external antennas. Platoons could speak to their commanders using handheld devices, although their range was limited. The sound quality depended on the area, the weather, and interference. Throughout the war, electronic warfare became increasingly important. It wasn't just firepower that counted, but also the ability to see first, detect first, or confuse the enemy. Germany started with an advantage in this area, but the Allies soon followed suit with advances of their own. Fritz X, Mistel, and H-293, the bombs that Germany controlled by remote control. One of the Luftwaffe's most advanced ideas during World War II was to guide bombs from an airplane toward a moving target. Until then, bombs had been dropped by eye, from a height, with luck or calculation, but with no possibility of correcting their direction once they were in the air. What German technicians proposed was to be able to move the bomb as it fell, to make it more precise. The first serious model was the Fritz X, a bomb very similar to a standard 1,400 kilogram bomb, but with small cross-shaped wings and a tail section with movable surfaces. The device was released from a fairly high altitude and controlled by the aircraft's gunner with a kind of remote, like a joystick, which sent signals by radio. To track the bomb, the tail was painted white, and the operator observed it through an optical sight. By moving the control, he could correct its path if it went off course. It was a primitive system, but it worked. The first time it was used successfully was in September 1943, when they sank the Roma, an Italian battleship that was sailing to North Africa after signing its surrender to the Allies. Another guided bomb was the H-293, which was lighter but incorporated a small rocket motor that ignited after being released. This gave it greater horizontal range and allowed it to fly toward its target almost like an airplane. Like the Fritz X, it was also controlled by radio signals from the launching aircraft. The operator guided it remotely to the target, especially enemy ships at sea. The HS-293 was used several times against Allied convoys, especially in the English Channel and the Atlantic. The British, realizing that it was radio-guided, attempted to jam the signal with electronic jamming. This reduced its effectiveness but did not completely eliminate it. Several vessels were damaged or sunk by these weapons. There was another even stranger system, called Mistel, which consisted of joining two planes, a large one below, loaded with a huge bomb in the nose, and a small one above that, guided. The pilot sat in the top position, and when they were close to the target, he released the bomb plane, which crashed and exploded with a brutal payload. It was used to attack bridges, ships, and fortifications. These three types of guided bombs demonstrated that Germany was far ahead in ideas that are commonplace today. Although they were cumbersome and difficult to use, they showed that the concept of guided missiles was already in place before the war ended. Despite this, the impact of these weapons was significant. The sinking of the Roma, caused by a Fritz X, was a clear example of their potential. On other occasions, entire convoys had to change course or suspend operations because they knew the area was dangerous for this type of attack. The Mistel, on the other hand, was more complicated to use. As the smaller aircraft was unmanned and packed with explosives, any failure in the docking or guidance system could cause it to veer off course. It was also difficult to hide such a large aircraft, so it wasn't ideal for surprise attacks. But even so, there were successful missions, especially against bridges and reinforced positions. Nazi jets, the planes that arrived too early. One of Germany's greatest technical achievements during the war was putting a jet-powered fighter plane into the air. The Allies were also working on this, but the Germans were the first to truly achieve it. The model that made the difference was the Messerschmitt Me 262, a twin-engine fighter that flew much faster than any propeller-driven aircraft of its time. Jet engine development had begun before the war. In Germany, work was led by the Heinkel and Junkers companies, which focused on finding a way to use high-pressure gases to spin a turbine and generate thrust. At first, the task was difficult. Materials wore out quickly, parts overheated, and tests frequently failed. But little by little, they solved the problems. The first German aircraft to fly with a jet engine was the Heinkel He-178 in August 1939. It was a small experimental aircraft built solely to prove that the system worked. Later came the Heinkel He 280, also with twin jet engines, which flew well but was never used in combat because the Luftwaffe decided to invest in Messerschmitt's project. The Me 262 began to take shape in 1940, although it wasn't until 1942 that it was truly successful in flight. Initially, problems with the engines continued. They broke down quickly, lasted only 20 hours of use, and required constant maintenance. Even so, it was the fastest aircraft in the world at the time. It exceeded 850 kilometers per hour, which was impossible for any propeller-driven fighter. It had 4 cannons in the nose and could easily destroy bombers. Besides the Me 262, there were other interesting jet aircraft. The Arado R-234 was the world's first jet bomber. It used 2 wing-mounted engines and could fly so high and fast that it was almost impossible to intercept. It was used for reconnaissance missions and also to drop bombs, albeit in small numbers. There was also the Horton Ho 229 project, a flying wing-shaped aircraft with no fuselage or tail. It was intended as a low-radar fighter, although it never made it past the testing stage. The design was so advanced that decades later it served as a Dandai inspiration for stealth aircraft. The Me 262 was not only fast, it was also stable, easy to maneuver, and had plenty of power to shoot down heavy bombers. When it dove from above, it was nearly impossible for an enemy aircraft to avoid it. Pilots flying conventional fighters couldn't keep up. But while it had many advantages, it also had limitations. One of them was that the engines took a long time to react when the pilot accelerated. This made takeoff and landing difficult. Furthermore, if the plane moved abruptly, the engines could shut down automatically. Because the interior materials wore easily, the engines only lasted a few dozen hours before needing to be replaced. Despite everything, the Me 262 saw combat in 1944. It attacked in small groups and managed to do a lot of damage, especially against Allied bombers. But it was too late. Although the plane was far superior in technology, there weren't enough trained pilots or fuel to take full advantage of it. The Arado R-234 also flew real-life missions, primarily for aerial photography. At first, it didn't have normal landing gear, but a detachable carriage that was released after takeoff and landed on skids. Later, retractable wheels were added so it could operate from conventional runways. This bomber was fast, but it couldn't carry many bombs, and its drop accuracy wasn't very good. However, it served to show that jet aircraft could have uses beyond direct combat. The Horton Ho 229, although not completed in time for combat, was one of the most striking designs. Its bat-wing-like shape made it difficult to detect by radar. Only a few prototypes were built, and one of them was taken to the United States after the war for study. All these models confirmed that Germany had fully entered the jet age. Although its aircraft didn't change the course of the conflict, they paved the way for what would come next. The fighters, bombers, and spy planes that would fly in the following decades would borrow many ideas from those early German prototypes. Impossible prototypes. The strangest ideas of the Third Reich Germany didn't just work on conventional weapons. It also greenlit a long list of experimental projects, ranging from the logical to the completely bizarre. Many remained as initial drawings or tests, but they reflected an interest in seeking unusual solutions to a conflict that was dragging on longer than expected. Among these projects was the Bar 349 Natter, a very unusual aircraft that took off vertically from a tower. It was designed to be flown directly into a formation of enemy bombers by a single pilot. It had solid-fuel rockets for climbing, a main engine that ignited mid-air, and a detachable cockpit so the pilot could bail out after firing his payload. In theory, it was reusable, but in practice only one flew with a pilot on board, and it ended in a crash. Another curious design was the DFS 346, a rocket plane with thin wings designed to fly at speeds close to Mach 2. It was developed with the help of data collected by test pilot Lippisch. The aircraft was launched from another aircraft in the air and then fired its rocket engine to reach high altitudes. It never entered service, although the idea was revived by the Soviet Union after the war. There were also studies on flying wings, armed gliders, and rocket-powered fighters. The Me-163 Comet was one of the few used in combat. It was small, bullet-shaped, and used hypergolic fuel that exploded on contact. It climbed extremely rapidly and could reach over 900 kilometers per hour, 560 miles per hour, but it only had a few minutes of endurance. After attacking, it glided to the ground, where it was very vulnerable. Despite its speed, the Me-163 was not very successful. Its engine was dangerous, the landing difficult, and the attacks ineffective, as firing at high speed without stabilization did not guarantee hitting the target. Many pilots died due to system failures or landing accidents. Another unusual invention was the Skoda Kauba SKP-14, a kind of winged manned torpedo boat that used a ramjet engine and was designed for suicide missions. It never made it past the prototype stage, but it showed the desperation with which new ideas were sought. There were also proposals for enormous bombers such as the Junkers Ju-390, which was a stretched version of the Ju-290 and could in theory fly to America and back. Only a few examples were built for testing. Within the same group of strange ideas was the Flugzeugträger Graf Zeppelin, an aircraft carrier that Germany began to build but never finished. Despite advances in naval engineering, the project was cancelled several times and ultimately fell unused. Germany had no real experience with naval operations of this type, and its priority was elsewhere: submarines and air defense. As for submarines, new ideas were also being considered. Type 21 U-boats were designed, which could remain submerged longer thanks to more powerful batteries and a more hydrodynamic hull shape. Although they arrived late to the war, they paved the way for modern submarines. Some were captured intact and studied by the United States and the Soviet Union. There were also experiments with surface-to-air missiles, such as the Wasserfall, which used technology similar to the V-2 but was smaller in size. The idea was that it could intercept enemy bombers from the ground. The missile had radio guidance but was never used operationally. The project fell by the wayside, although it served as the basis for anti-aircraft missiles in subsequent decades. The effort to develop new weapons was enormous but also chaotic. Many projects overlapped, funding was lacking, and information wasn't always shared between teams. Time pressures and constant bombing raids on factories and facilities further hampered progress. When the war ended, the Allies found an archive full of sketches, models, engines, and half-built parts. All of this was collected and taken to different countries for analysis. Many of these ideas, which seemed fanciful at the time, were later successfully revived. Although most of these prototypes never saw combat, they demonstrated a radical approach to military innovation. Rather than improving what already existed, they sought entirely different paths. The perfect soldier, weapons and personal equipment ahead of their time. Throughout the conflict, many new handguns were designed and manufactured, seeking greater power, accuracy, and ease of use. One of the most important was the Sturmgewehr 44, which can be considered the world's first assault rifle. This weapon combined the rapid-fire capability of a machine gun with the maneuverability of a rifle. It fired intermediate chamber ammunition, allowing for better control when firing bursts. It was shorter than a traditional rifle and more effective in close-quarters combat. The design of the STG-44 was a direct response to the needs of the Eastern Front, where soldiers faced enemies at close range, often in urban or forest environments. The army needed a weapon that offered a greater volume of fire than a standard rifle, but without the weight and recoil of a full machine gun. In addition to the STG-44, other personal weapons were developed. For example, the MP-40, an automatic submachine gun with a straight magazine and folding stock, was widely used by assault troops and paratroopers. Although not as accurate at long range, it performed well in close quarters. Another innovation was the use of portable grenade launchers like the Panzerfaust. This was a disposable tube that fired a hollow charge capable of penetrating the armor of Allied tanks. It required no complex training. A private could use it with little instruction. The Panzerschreck, on the other hand, was larger, reloadable, and had a protective shield, but served a similar purpose. Hand mines, adhesive charges, special knives, and various types of grenades, such as the classic handle grenade, which is easier to throw, were also designed. Rifles with telescopic sights for snipers and models specifically designed for use in snow, desert, or wet environments were produced. Germany even explored silent weapons with pistols equipped with suppressors and subsonic bullets. This type of equipment was used by special units, spies, or sabotage missions behind enemy lines. Although limited in number, it demonstrated the extent to which all types of scenarios were considered. In addition to weapons, research was also conducted to improve the equipment worn by soldiers. Uniforms designed for different climates were introduced, with fabrics resistant to extreme cold or moisture. The Waffen-SS, for example, used camouflage uniforms, something uncommon in other armies of the time. These designs sought to better conceal combatants in wooded or snowy environments. Experimental night vision goggles were also developed. The system used infrared light reflected by a spotlight, which was captured by a special lens. These goggles were large and heavy and were only mounted on vehicles or fixed weapons. Even so, they were a preview of what would later become common. Panther tanks even tested this equipment in night combat, albeit in very limited numbers. Programs were implemented to improve individual first aid kits, providing soldiers with painkillers, adhesive bandages, and basic treatments for infections. Helmets were also modernized, using molded steel with improved shock absorption. The German helmet design was so practical that many countries copied its shape years later. Another aspect of the advancement was in communication. Smaller, portable radios were introduced for squads, allowing for better coordination of movements. There were also headsets for tankers and artillery operators. Although rudimentary, compared to those of today, they were superior to those used by other armies at that time. German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, received specific equipment. They wore cut-off helmets, knee pads, and compact weapons like the FG-42, a combination of an automatic rifle and a light machine gun, designed especially for them. This model allowed firing from the shoulder or in a prone position and had a folding bayonet. Drugs were even explored to keep soldiers awake or improve their resistance to fatigue. Some troops were given methamphetamine pills to endure long marches without sleep. Although this had serious side effects, at the time it was seen as a temporary solution to maintain momentum at the front. The combination of technical innovation and war pressure led Germany to develop, within a few years, a wide variety of personal combat tools. Although many did not change the outcome of the conflict, several influenced how a modern soldier is armed and equipped. Midget submarines and suicide weapons, Hitler's latest naval gambles. In the final stages of the war, Germany began testing one-man marine craft. One of the first was the Neger, which was really nothing more than a modified torpedo. It had the same shape as a standard G7E torpedo, but on top was an acrylic cockpit where the pilot sat while lying down. That pilot used a simple periscope to guide the vehicle, and his only mission was to approach an enemy vessel, aim as best he could, and then release the real torpedo, which was mounted just below. There was no way to exit if the craft failed or became trapped. This model was battery-powered, and its range was very limited. It also had no real protection against nearby gunfire or explosions. What made it useful was that it could approach silently and attack by surprise. Although many pilots were killed on the missions, some managed to sink small ships. The idea was to use it as a human torpedo, though without the operator directly crashing into it. Next came the Marder, an improvement on the Neger. It had the same base but could dive a few meters, giving it more options for approaching undetected. It was also electric and operated with very simple controls. It had no re-entry equipment, so the pilot knew his life was at risk from the moment he emerged. Another device was the Molch, more like a miniature submarine. It measured about 8 meters and had an elongated shape. It was completely underwater, although very close to the surface. It was operated by a single person and armed with 2 live torpedoes in the front. Its range was short and its maneuverability limited, making it very difficult to use in waters with currents or active defenses. The Molchs were used primarily in the Mediterranean, and although they were designed for large-scale operations, the results were poor. Many missed their targets or were destroyed before firing. Even so, dozens were manufactured because the German command wanted to try every possible means to stop Allied convoys. And in parallel, the Biber, another slightly more sophisticated midget submarine, was built. This one already had room for 2 people, although only one person was almost always present. It had a small diesel engine for surface travel and an electric one for underwater navigation. Unlike the Molch, the Biber could dive deeper and travel longer distances. It also carried 2 torpedoes on its sides. Its weakness was that it often leaked water, and visibility from the cockpit was almost zero. The Bibers were launched from coastal ports to attack ships near England and in the English Channel, but as with the other models, the success rate was very low. Some sank before reaching the port, Others were detected by radar, and several went off course and ran out of fuel. The design of these weapons showed a mix of desperation and creativity. They were developed in a short time, using recycled parts or adapted from other aircraft. Their military utility was limited, but they represented a form of unconventional warfare that Germany attempted to exploit in the final years of the conflict. The attacks were coordinated by special units, often using tugs or motherships to bring the small submarines closer to the target. The missions were carried out at night, with no communication with base and with minimal instructions. Although these models were far from comparable to traditional large U-boats, they were much cheaper, easier to produce, and didn't require large crews. In theory, they could operate in areas where normal U-boats couldn't access, such as Allied ports or landing sites. But of the hundreds of devices launched, only a few managed to hit any target. The Nazi command maintained these operations until the last year, hoping that they would at least delay the Allied advances. Another device tested during those same years was the Linse launch, a small motorboat designed for strike missions against enemy ships. It was not a submarine, but rather a type of explosive boat operated by a single crew member. Its construction was quite simple: a lightweight hull, a seat with basic controls, and an explosive charge fixed to the bow. The pilot steered the boat at full speed toward the target. Just before impact, he would jump into the water and let the vessel continue on its own. The payload exploded upon contact with the target or upon activation of a proximity detonator. In many cases, jumping did not guarantee survival. There was a risk of being hit by the blast or enemy fire. These types of attacks required very specific conditions. Linse boats operated best in poorly guarded areas or on surprise missions. They moved quickly, but were visible and vulnerable to fire. Sometimes they were launched in groups of 3. 2 would attack directly, and the third would serve as backup or to retrieve the pilot who had jumped into the water. They are known to have been used in various ports in Northern Europe. The results varied widely. Some missions succeeded in sinking anchored ships or damaging port structures, but many boats were destroyed before reaching their target. Even so, the German command continued to rely on this type of resource, believing that strategic damage could be caused with limited resources. And in general, all of these weapons, midget submarines, human torpedoes, and explosive boats, were part of a desperate strategy to halt the Allied advance in the final years of the conflict. They were built quickly with readily available materials and without time for lengthy testing. Operator training was basic. On paper, these special units were part of what was called the Kleinkampfverbände, a force dedicated to sabotage and small vehicle attacks. For the most part, they operated without air support or naval cover. They carried only written orders, target instructions, and, at best, a map. The use of these weapons was not secret, but it was handled discreetly. Official reports of casualties or failures were avoided. Surviving pilots returned by their own means, if possible, or were picked up by mothership submarines. There was no organized rescue structure. Many disappeared without a trace. The technical level of these machines was inferior to other, more sophisticated German weapons, such as rockets or jets. But their importance lay in the message: Germany was prepared to continue fighting with any means, even if it meant sending a single man with a bomb on a mission of almost no return. These were not simple experiments. They were real weapons, built, delivered, and used in combat. Several of them are preserved today in museums as examples of that final stage in which any attempt to stop the enemy was accepted, no matter how improbable. The weapon that wasn't the Nazi atomic bomb. By the 1930s, there were already indications that splitting the nucleus of an atom released an enormous amount of energy. This came from studies by European scientists. When war broke out, Germany tried to weaponize the idea, but didn't make as much progress as other countries. The main reason was that the team in charge didn't receive the resources or support they needed. The German atomic project was initially managed by the army, but was later taken over by a section of the Ministry of Education. Physicist Werner Heisenberg was one of those leading the research. His group understood the principles well, but they faced many obstacles. They lacked key materials such as pure uranium and heavy water, which were necessary to maintain a stable chain reaction. Natural uranium had to be processed to separate the useful isotope, and that step took time and required technology that Germany didn't have fully developed. The heavy water, used as a moderator in the reactors, came from a plant in Norway, but the Allies sabotaged its production and transportation several times. The idea was to use one of these methods to generate a controlled reaction and then turn it into an explosion. But without the proper materials, the project progressed slowly. Furthermore, not everyone within the Nazi regime believed in the potential of this weapon. Some thought it would take too long or that it wasn't worth the effort compared to other weapons already in development. During the first few years, tests were conducted with small experimental reactors. The design included blocks of uranium submerged in heavy water, trying to see if a sustained reaction could be achieved. But the results were limited. None of these reactors ever fully functioned. Calculations showed that much larger quantities of uranium were needed, which were not easily available. Meanwhile, the United States had already launched the Manhattan Project with much more money, scientists, and industrial plants. Germany didn't have anything on that scale. Heisenberg's team was isolated without access to materials or other international research. Meetings were held in secret, and there was no collaboration with other Axis countries. As the war progressed, the atomic project took a back seat. The High Command needed weapons that could be manufactured and used quickly. Missiles, jet planes, and submarines took priority. The nuclear program remained an experiment with no immediate application. As the Allies began advancing through Europe, they took the possibility of Germany having an atomic bomb very seriously. Special teams were organized to search for factories, laboratories, and depots related to nuclear energy. One such group was Operation Alsos, which aimed to secure everything related to uranium or heavy water before it fell into Soviet hands. During their missions, they encountered research centers, such as the one in Hechingen, where Heisenberg's team had been conducting its most advanced tests. They also found documents, reactor prototypes, and small quantities of uranium. However, the inspectors realized that the German project was nowhere near building a functional weapon. The German scientists' calculations were theoretically correct, but the resources were insufficient to achieve the chain reaction necessary for an atomic explosion. The uranium was in the form of small, unprocessed metal blocks or powder. The heavy water was in scattered tanks. Not a single assembly existed capable of generating a nuclear explosion. At the same time, it was discovered that many of the project scientists, including Heisenberg, had no idea how far the Manhattan Project had come. They were shocked to learn that the United States had actually achieved a detonation. In conversations secretly recorded after their capture, it was noted that they believed it was still years away. One of the major problems was the lack of a clear structure. The Nazi command never established an effective chain of direction for the atomic project. Each group worked independently without connection to other key sectors, such as heavy industry or the army. Furthermore, internal mistrust and interdepartmental warfare led to resources being blocked or mismanaged. Therefore, when Germany surrendered, there was no bomb under construction or immediate plans. There were only ideas, formulas, and scale models. Some scientists were taken to the United States or the United Kingdom for interrogation. Others remained in Germany under surveillance. The Nazi rocket that wanted to cross space to attack America in 1944, when the tide of the war was already turning against the Third Reich, some German designers began to look beyond the battlefield. Among them was Eugen Sänger, who, together with Irene Brett, worked on a flight project that was unparalleled. They wanted to build a ship that could cross the Atlantic without being hit, and that would do so without following the classic airplane route. Their proposal was a rocket plane that would climb almost out of the atmosphere and then bounce forward against it. The model was called the Silbervogel, which means silver bird. The design resembled an airplane, along with short wings and no windows. The idea was to launch it from an inclined ramp using rockets so that it would gain enough speed for takeoff. Once in the air, the main engine would push it to the desired altitude. Then it would fall slightly, hit the atmosphere, and rise again. It would continue in this way, making long jumps until it reached the other side of the world. This form of flight, called suborbital, was not science fiction. In the team's calculations, the Silbervogel could reach extremely high speeds, avoiding enemy interceptors and defense systems. The original objective was to bomb distant cities, such as New York, with a single explosive charge. Although it was never manufactured, the theory was sound. For this type of device to work, highly heat-resistant materials were needed. Each bounce in the atmosphere generated enormous friction. Engineers knew this could melt parts of the fuselage if proper coatings weren't used. It also required precise control of trajectory and speed. If it went too high, it could lose momentum and not return to the correct angle. If it went too low, it could break from the air pressure. The design never made it past the paper stage. Even so, the documents reached the Allies after the war. Engineers who reviewed those plans acknowledged that the calculations were correct. In fact, the idea was so advanced that years later it inspired other space projects in the United States and the Soviet Union. The idea of using atmospheric bounce flights resurfaced in space exploration programs. Within Germany, the Silbervogel was not a priority. Compared to the V-1 or V-2 missiles, which were already in production, this new model seemed like something distant. The Third Reich was not in a position to invest resources in a technology that still required years of development. However, the mere fact that it was planned demonstrates the level of ambition that existed in certain quarters. This project wasn't the only one that attempted to break away from the traditional boundaries of aerial combat. Other forms of unmanned aircraft were also considered, including aircraft with unconventional designs and rockets capable of reaching great heights. But the Silbervogel was the most radical of all. It aimed to fly off the planet, even if only for a few seconds, to return from the heights and strike with precision. No prototype was built. Everything remained in calculations, sketches, and models. But if it had been carried out, the result would have been one of the strangest and most advanced machines of its time. What makes the Silbervogel special is that it wasn't just a concept, but a set of data that matched up. Technically, it was possible. All that was lacking was time, money, and a place to test it. When the war ended, many of those engineers were recruited by other powers. The Silbervogel project, although forgotten by the general public, was analyzed by experts from other countries who were quick to see its potential. Thus, an idea born in the final days of the Third Reich ended up silently influencing the race to conquer space. In the end, what distinguished Nazi Germany was not just the number of weapons it developed, but the kinds of ideas it was willing to test. In the midst of collapse, they gambled on everything, from realistic projects to almost pointless experiments. It was a period marked by urgency, improvisation, and an obsession with going one step further no matter what. The risks. After the war, many of those ideas were dispersed, others were copied, and some ended up in museums. What remained was a clear example of how far a military power can go when it's willing to try anything, even when it has nothing left to lose.